In the quiet stretch of Alabama, where cornfields meet forgotten tracks, a priest arrives at a convent that hasn't answered in weeks. The sisters say little, the rooms hold their breath, and somewhere between old psalms and hidden stairwells, a voice long silenced begins to speak again, but not in words, in veils, in ashes, in bells that ring when no one pulls the rope. Some truths don't shout, they whisper from behind locked doors, and this time, someone's listening. Chapter 1: The Chapel at Dust Creek. The road to Dust Creek wasn't marked on most maps anymore. Over the years, its edges had faded beneath layers of red dust and neglect, swallowed up by fields that once bore cotton but now sprouted nothing but silence. Insects buzzed with lazy menace under the sun, and not even the crows dared linger too long. At the end of that forgotten road stood St. Agnes Retreative. One could still call it that. The small chapel, its white paint now cracked and graying like old bones, slouched against a backdrop of scorched pines and forgotten farmland. The bell tower, once proud, now leaned slightly, as if stooping under the weight of unspoken prayers. Father Malcolm Price parked his government-issued Chevy Impala just shy of the gravel loop that circled the chapel. The wheels crunched the parched dirt, sending tiny pebbles skittering like panicked secrets. When he stepped out, the sun hit him like a furnace door swinging wide. His boots sank into the brittle earth, the dust immediately finding its way to the cuffs of his trousers. In the back seat sat 2 battered suitcases and a worn leather folder, its corners curled from years of being passed hand to hand without resolution. Inside were 3 letters sent to St. Agnes over the past 2 months, all unanswered. And then there was the report. Sparse in words but heavy in implication. Sister Mary Clement has disappeared. No explanation. Other residents are not speaking freely. Retreat no longer responsive. Further inquiry requested. Malcolm was not a stranger to silence. He'd served in desert chapels during wartime, presided over field burials where no hymns were sung, and heard confessions that never left his spine. But this silence felt different. Not the stillness of peace or reverence. It was the absence of something that had once tried to scream. The wind stirred, dry and scentless, lifting strands of his graying hair as he approached the chapel steps. A screen door hung off its hinge, creaking with each gust. The wooden entrance beneath it stood ajar, as if reluctantly waiting. He paused, not because of fear. Malcolm had known too many ghosts to fear new ones, but out of respect. He removed his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stepped inside. The chapel interior was dim, dust swirling in narrow rays of sunlight that filtered through fractured stained glass. Wooden pews sat obediently in rows, their cushions sun-bleached and threadbare. At the altar, a brass crucifix leaned slightly to one side, its surface dulled by age and neglect. A single candle rested in a glass holder, unlit, but blackened at the rim from long ago flame. The air was thick, not with heat, but with history. Something had settled here long before Malcolm arrived. Something heavy. He moved toward the front pew and set his folder down. From within his coat pocket, he pulled a folded photograph. Sister Mary Clement, age 27, taken at her vows ceremony 2 years ago. In the photo, her face was bright, unguarded. She stood with her hands clasped and eyes lifted to heaven, unaware that one day someone would come looking for her with only a file and a name. Behind the altar, a door led into the adjoining convent, long, single-story stone structure that once housed over a dozen women. Now it stood quiet. Malcolm pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hallway stretched out like a tunnel of shadows. Faded portraits lined the walls, nuns from decades past, each face a blend of serenity and severity. Somewhere farther down, a wall clock ticked with mechanical insistence, the only sound apart from his footsteps. He passed a common room with mismatched chairs and a wrecked record player covered in a crocheted doily. A pot of dead lavender sat on the windowsill. He passed an office with a desk strewn with yellowed papers and a rotary phone that hadn't been touched in years. Then he reached a door marked with a brass plaque, Mother Superior Judith Monroe. The door was closed. Malcolm considered knocking but didn't. He would return later. For now, he needed to feel the building, to walk it, to listen not just for voices, but for the silence between them. He returned to the chapel, sat again in the front pew, and lit the candle. The flame flinched, then steadied, casting faint light on the crucifix. He closed his eyes and whispered aloud, not a prayer, not a command, a question. What happened to you, Sister Clement? Somewhere in the chapel, a board creaked, and outside, the bell tower swayed just slightly, though no wind blew. Chapter 2. The Sister Who Vanished. Inside the convent's refectory, the long wooden table sat untouched, except for the faint traces of breadcrumbs and lukewarm tea left behind after morning prayers. The air held the soft clink of cutlery, and whispers, nothing loud, nothing defiant, just the murmur of habits maintained. Father Malcolm Price stood near the threshold, hat in hand, eyes scanning the room filled with women dressed in gray habits and careful glances. Sister Miriam, an older nun with a voice like dried leaves, greeted him first. "Father Price, we are grateful for your visit," she said. Her hands were folded in front of her like parchment pressed between the pages of a forgotten hymn book. "We've been managing." "I'm here about Sister Evelyn," Malcolm said. Straight to the point. The sound of spoons stirring tea stopped. A heavy stillness dropped into the room. The warmth faded. The nuns glanced at one another, then back to their cups. One young sister, no more than 20, bit her lower lip until it blanched. "She was sensitive," murmured Sister Claire, finally, "but devout. She preferred solitude." "She hasn't been seen in over a week," Malcolm said. "Her letters stopped arriving. Her family is worried. So is the diocese." No one responded immediately. Sister Miriam offered a weak smile. Perhaps she felt called elsewhere. With no word. "Sometimes, Father, the spirit moves quickly." He wasn't convinced. After the meal, Malcolm was given a tour of the grounds. When they reached Sister Evelyn's quarters, the hallway grew colder. Her door was locked, not unusual, they said, for a sister on retreat. But no one had seen her come or go. He asked for the key. Sister Miriam hesitated before producing it from a ring looped through her belt. Inside, the room was clean but too still. The bed was made. The closet empty. Her suitcase was gone. Yet a few belongings remained. A ceramic cross on the wall, a scarf tucked in the nightstand drawer, and on her small desk, an open prayer book. Malcolm leaned in to read the page. It was Psalm 55. "For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house we walked in the throng." The page was worn at the edges, the ink slightly smudged as if traced by trembling fingers. He turned and noticed a faint indentation on the floor where a trunk once stood. The absence itself spoke louder than any words the sisters had offered. He found a slip of paper tucked inside the back cover of the prayer book. A single line, written in pencil. "Silence is sometimes the only sin that survives the night." A noise behind him made Malcolm turn. It was Sister Claire, lingering at the doorway. She said strange things before she left. She said, barely above a whisper, that something in the chapel made her afraid, that the silence here had weight. She'll say why. Claire looked over her shoulder, then back at him, only that she'd seen something that wasn't meant to be seen. Malcolm closed the prayer book and nodded, slipping the paper into his pocket. The room no longer felt like a cell for prayer. It felt like a space vacated and has to retreat, not toward peace, but away from something far darker. And as he stepped out, locking the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sister Evelyn hadn't left of her own free will, that she had vanished, but not alone. Chapter 3. Scratches in the floor. The west hallway of St. Agnes Retreat was colder than the rest of the convent. Not in temperature, but in memory. The air there felt heavier, as if it clung to something that hadn't yet passed on. Faded portraits of saints lined the wood-paneled walls, their eyes cast downward, their halos dimmed by years of dust and silence. Father Malcolm Price moved slowly, flashlight in hand, its beam cutting a soft cone through the musty air. His steps were muffled against the old runner rug that stretched the length of the corridor, its floral patterns faded and threadbare. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just walking, sensing, letting the quiet guide him, and then he stepped on something that didn't belong. A hollow thud beneath his heel. He stopped, retraced his step, and pressed again. This time, the same sound echoed back up, but dull and distant. A loose floorboard. Malcolm knelt, peeling back the edge of the runner and placing his fingers beneath the warped plank. With effort, it lifted, revealing a shallow compartment carved into the floor beneath. Inside, a small bundle of aged envelopes, bound together by a red satin ribbon. The ribbon was dusty but strong, its knot tied tightly as if whoever hid them hadn't intended for them to be found by just anyone. Malcolm sat back on his heels, carefully unwrapping the bundle. The letters smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. The ink had faded to a bluish gray, the handwriting elegant and emotional. Every envelope was addressed to Sister Eval, but none of them were signed with a full name, only a single letter, R. The tone was intimate, not romantic, but raw confessional. The early letters spoke of doubt, of questions that could not be voiced within the convent walls, questions about scripture, about obedience, about what happened in the retreats past that the sisters refused to speak of. By the fourth letter, the writer had begun using phrases like hidden truths and unspoken debts. By the seventh, the handwriting became more frantic, the lines uneven, ink smudged in places, and then the final letter, shorter than the rest, no date, no formal greeting. You were right to be afraid. I didn't see it until now. I should have listened. Please forgive me if it's too late. No signature. Just that solitary R again. Malcolm exhaled slowly, feeling a chill slide across his neck. The kind of chill he'd learned to trust during his years overseas, the kind that didn't come from air, but from intuition. Something was buried deeper here, something Sister Evelyn had discovered, something that R had confirmed too late. He rose, rewrapping the letters with the same ribbon, and slid them into the inside pocket of his coat. As he did, he noticed something etched into the underside of the lifted floorboard, barely visible in the dim light. Scratches, not words, more like frantic lines, as if someone had tried to claw a message into the wood. A cross, a circle, and beneath them, a rough arrow pointing toward the chapel. He stood still for a moment, listening. Not a sound from the other rooms, no footsteps, no voices, just the soft, constant creak of the old building settling into itself, as if trying to remember its sins. He closed the floorboard and replaced the rug. Then, with the letters against his chest and the image of the scratched symbols burned into his mind, Malcolm turned toward the chapel, where the arrow had pointed, where something, perhaps everything, had begun. Chapter 4. Ivy and Shadows. The path behind the convent had long since vanished beneath brambles and neglect, yet Sister Madeline walked it without hesitation, her worn boots crunching over moss-covered stone and tangled roots. Father Malcolm Price followed a few paces behind, shielding his eyes against the pale midday light filtering through bare-limbed trees. The farther they went from the chapel, the more the landscape seemed to fold in on itself, as if the land, like the sisters, was trying to forget something. It's this way, Sister Madeline said, her voice a soft thread that barely rose above the whispering breeze. Her veil fluttered gently behind her, catching on thorny vines as she moved. We don't come out here much anymore. Not since, well, you'll see. They came to a rusted gate that hung crooked between two collapsing brick columns. Beyond it, nestled between the overgrowth, stood a forgotten greenhouse, its frame sagging under the weight of years, its glass panels cracked and fogged with time. Ivy twisted around its skeletal structure like it was trying to hold the place together or pull it down completely. Madeline pushed open the gate, which groaned in protest. The sound startled a crow from its perch atop the greenhouse, its wings slicing the silence as it flew. Inside, the air was damp and clinging, thick with the scent of rotting soil and the ghosts of forgotten seasons. Leaves long dead, the stone floor. Ferns had taken root in the corners, growing wild and unchecked. What had once been a sanctuary of cultivation was now a tomb for things that had been planted but never harvested. In the center of the room stood a long wooden workbench, its surface littered with brittle stems, broken clay pots, and the rusted remains of gardening tools. But it wasn't the bench that drew Malcolm's eye. It was the tiny ceramic sparrow resting gently in a patch of disturbed soil, beneath a shattered window pane. Its glaze had chipped in places, revealing white beneath a coat of dusty blue. It looked like it had been placed there recently, too recently for this forgotten space. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper, browned at the edges, the corners curled with moisture. Sister Madeline stood back, watching him as he knelt to pick it up. The note read, in looping cursive, "Some scenes grow in silence, no signature, no date, just those 5 words." Malcolm stood slowly, his eyes sweeping the greenhouse. Something about the place made his skin itch, as if it were watching him. Back, there were signs of past carols where things had once been planted, faint outlines of labels on old wooden stakes. A single leather glove lay half buried in the soil near the far wall. Was this Evelyn's? He asked without looking away. Madeline hesitated. She tended it alone, said she liked the quiet. But after the fire in the east wing, she barely came out here, said the plants whispered things at night. Malcolm turned. What kind of things? Madeline shook her head. She wouldn't say. Just that some things don't stay buried, even in dirt. He crouched again, brushing aside a layer of leaves to reveal a pattern of scratches in the stone beneath the sparrow. Not letters, this time just a circle, and within it, a small cross, the same symbol scratched beneath the floorboard. A mark, a message. Madeline took a step closer. You think she left it for someone to find? I think she didn't want to be forgotten, Malcolm said. Or maybe she didn't want what she knew to die with her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the ivy along the glass. It sounded almost like whispers, the kind that filled a confessional, or a warning. He carefully folded the note and tucked it into his coat, the ceramic bird he left where it was. As he and Madeline stepped back out into the daylight, the convent loomed in the distance, its steeple barely visible through the trees. But Malcolm didn't look back at it. He was thinking about Evelyn, about soil. About what it meant to bury something and what it meant when it didn't stay buried. Chapter 5. A Midnight Visitor. The convent at Dust Creek had always been a quiet place, lulled by the chirr of insects and the occasional wind moaning through the cotton fields. But at precisely 12:05 a.m., that quiet cracked like old plaster. A knock, soft but insistent, echoed through the narrow guest quarters where Father Malcolm Price lay awake beneath a thin wool blanket, eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. He hadn't slept much since his arrival. The silence here wasn't the restful kind. It was expectant, as if the walls were waiting for someone to speak a name best forgotten. Another knock, then a whispered, "Father." He rose from bed, pulling on his coat. The air was sharp with the chill of fall and something else, something that made his skin feel too tight. Opening the door, he found Sister Lorna standing just beyond the threshold. Her robe hung loosely from her narrow frame, and her bare feet were pale against the cold stone floor. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, glimmered with a sort of desperation that made Malcolm instantly alert. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I haven't told the others." He stepped aside, and she entered silently, clutching a small cloth bundle in her hands. "I was awake the night Sister Evelyn vanished," she began, her voice hushed and hurried. "Couldn't sleep. I was walking the hallway when I heard voices." Malcolm leaned forward. "Voices," she nodded, her lips tightening. "One of them was Evelyn, but the other ... It was a man. Calm, low, but not someone from the convent. I swear, Father, it chilled me to hear it." He waited. "They were coming from the chapel," she continued. "But when I looked in, there was no one there, just the crucifix. And then, the bell rang." Malcolm blinked. "The chapel bell?" "Yes, once. Loud enough to rattle the window panes." Her eyes flicked toward the dark hallway. "But no one pulled the rope. I checked. The door to the bell tower was still bolted." She unfolded the cloth bundle, revealing a silver rosariet's crucifix, dulled with use, one bead cracked down the middle. "I found this behind the altar the next morning. It's Evelyn's. I know it. She never took it off." Malcolm took the rosary carefully, feeling its weight in his palm, cold, heavy, like memory. He said nothing for a moment, eyes tracing the beads. Then, "Why come to me now?" Sister Lorna's mouth trembled. "Because silence here is like a second vow. We all take it. We pretend. We keep our eyes down. But whatever happened to Evelyn didn't begin that night. It was growing. We all felt it. And now she's gone. And the silence is ... loud." He gestured to the chair near his desk, and she sat, folding her hands in her lap like a child awaiting punishment. "Did Evelyn ever mention being afraid?" he asked. Lorna nodded slowly, not in words, but in her eyes. "Especially the last week. She avoided chapel. She skipped meals. And once, I saw her standing in the garden long after sunset, barefoot, just ... standing." "Did she say anything?" "Then," she said, "I think they know." I asked who. She didn't answer. Malcolm stood, moving to the window. Outside, the moon hung low and fat, spilling pale light across the cloistered courtyard. Somewhere, a bird called, or something, that sounded like one. "You can't tell the others I came," Lorna said quickly. "They won't understand. Some of them. They're more afraid of truth than of ghosts." Malcolm turned, his expression unreadable. "You did the right thing." As she rose to leave, he handed her back the empty cloth. "Keep your door locked tonight." After she disappeared into the shadows, Malcolm sat for a long while, turning the rosary over in his hands. The cracked bead, the worn silver, the feeling that this wasn't just a disappearance, it was a silencing. He placed the rosary on the desk beside Evelyn's unopened prayer book. It was still open to Psalm 55. My heart is in anguish within me, ... and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. The candle flame flickered once, then held steady. Somewhere above, the wind brushed past the bell tower, and this time, the silence was thicker than any sound. Chapter 6. Ashes in the Fireplace. The morning sun barely crept through the cloudy window panes of the retreat's front office, casting a dull, yellowish hue across the room. Dust motes danced in the light, rising like forgotten memories as Malcolm stepped inside, boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The room had the feel of abandonment furniture draped in thin white cloths. Filing cabinets rusted at the handles, and on the far wall, an empty bulletin board with faded pushpin scars, as if once it had held messages too urgent to be left unsaid. A cold, disused hearth sat in the corner, its bricks dark with soot and years of neglect. The smell was bitter old smoke and something more acidic, sharper like paper turned to ash. Before its story could be finished, Malcolm knelt before the fireplace, brushing aside charred debris with the back of his hand. Beneath a thin layer of soot, he discovered the remnants of what might have once been a letter. It was fragile, curled at the edges like the claws of a dying leaf, and nearly illegibly except for 3 words scorched into survival. She found out the rest had been sacrificed to flame. The ink blistered, faded into nothing, but those 3 words carried weight. Enough weight to bring a chill to Malcolm's spine, despite the morning's slow warmth. He turned the fragment over. There, barely visible in the corner where the signature should have been, was a faded insignia. At first glance, it looked like a stylized cross, but as Malcolm tilted it toward the light, the details came into focus. A triangle, enclosed by wings, a dagger piercing through its center. It was unmistakable, not the symbol of any religious order. No, it was the mark of the Aegis Division, private military consultancy Malcolm had encountered during his final years as a chaplain stationed in Iraq. The group operated in the gray zones between orders and morality. They answered to contracts, not countries. Their presence had always meant one thing: something worth hiding was nearby. A long breath escaped his chest, and with it, a part of the past he'd locked away. He hadn't expected to see that symbol again, not here. Not at a convent nestled in the sleepy folds of Alabama. It didn't make sense. What did the military contractor have to do with Sister Evelyn's disappearance, with a retreat center meant for prayer and reflection? Malcolm leaned back on his heels, eyes scanning the room with renewed suspicion. If someone had burned that letter, it meant they feared its contents, and if that insignia was on it, it meant someone connected to Aegis had once stood where he now knelt. He stood slowly, brushing ash from his hands onto his coat. The scent of burning still clung to his skin, acrid and invasive. He needed context records, receipts, something to connect this remote location to anything outside of faith and routine. He turned his attention to the filing cabinet in the corner. Most drawers were locked, but the second from the bottom gave way with a rusty groan. Inside were yellowed invoices for roof repairs, heating maintenance, standard convent supplies, nothing unusual at first glance, until he found a receipt, paid in cash to a security consultant. It bore no name, only a P.O. box from Texas. The date matched the week Sister Evelyn stopped writing her letters. Malcolm closed the drawer, mind racing. Someone had paid to keep something quiet, and someone else had tried to speak only to vanish before their voice reached the world. He returned to the hearth. For a moment, he considered taking the charred letter piece to Bishop Ramsey, but he knew what the bishop would say. Do not leap to conclusions. But Malcolm wasn't leaping. He was following breadcrumbs through the smoke, and they led somewhere dark. Chapter 7. Writing in the walls. The stairs that led from the convent's back hallway to the disused attic had long been forgotten, worn, smooth in the middle, and soft with age at the edges. Dust clung to the walls like memory. The plaster was cracked in places, and strips of faded wallpaper peeled downward like tired sighs. The convent had no shortage of neglected corners, but this stairwell carried a kind of breathless hush, as if it held a secret it was afraid to speak aloud. Malcolm climbed slowly, one hand brushing the banister, the other holding a lantern. He had come this way following no clear logic, just to pull some unspoken thread between everything he'd uncovered so far. The bells, the rosary, the half letter in the fireplace. Something was always just beneath the surface. At the second landing, his fingers caught on a snag in the wallpaper. A piece had curled up like an old scar, revealing a glimpse of aged wood underneath. He paused, leaning in, and gently peeled back more of the paper. The fabric-like pattern gave way with a soft tear. There, scratched faintly into the beam behind it, were two names, Evelyn plus Ruth. Below the names, in darker ink-like graphite, rubbed into the scratches were the words, "No more silence." Malcolm's pulse quickened. The pairing of names was intimate, defiant even. Ruth. He remembered that name. Sister Lorna had once spoken of a young woman who came to deliver food from the town depot years ago, but who stopped showing up after a winter storm, a drifter from the freight town called Meridian Hollow. Rumor had it she'd shared long walks with Evelyn behind the gardens, that they had laughed more than was expected of holy company. He photographed the wall with his phone, then just stood there, hands still on the wallpaper. The inscription wasn't old, maybe a year, maybe less. The pencil lines hadn't faded completely, and someone had covered it back up, gently perhaps even with regret. Back in the convent's library, Malcolm pulled records. Shipment ledgers from the local food pantry had Ruth's name listed a few times under a courier contract, but nothing official. She'd been off the grid, likely by choice. But the pattern was there. Ruth appeared regularly in supply lists until the entries stopped cold 4 months ago. He called the regional outreach office and asked if they had a record of a Ruth, no last name, connected to St. Agnes Retreat. After some shuffling, a woman on the other end confirmed there had been a Ruth Evers, listed once as a temp aide in food service. She was noted as friendly but volatile, with no fixed address. Malcolm jotted the name down and folded the stairwell photo into his leather folder. The next morning, he walked into town. Meridian Hollow sat in a depression between fields, its freight yard abandoned and crumbling. The local diner, called Connie Spoon, was the town's informal archive. Malcolm ordered a black coffee and asked about Ruth Evers. Ruth, said Connie, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Used to work at the Co-op, smart girl. Had a storm in her though. Don't think she liked how things went down with the sisters. She was sweet on one of them, I think. Then she disappeared. Folks said she hopped a freight north. That's what they say about everyone who leaves without goodbye. Did she ever talk about Evelyn? Connie paused. Not by name, but once I saw her tear up over a little brown notebook. Said she gave it to someone who promised to keep it safe. Next day she was gone. Malcolm drove back as clouds gathered, low and metallic, over the fields. The road shimmered with heat, though the air was chilled. In his mind, Evelyn and Ruth sat in the attic stairwell, whispering into the wood. Maybe it wasn't just about love. Maybe they had seen something, and if they had, Evelyn had stayed to fight it. But Ruth, she had run, or worse. Chapter 8. The Boxcar Girl. The road south of Dust Creek narrowed into gravel, then into dirt. Pecan trees cast long shadows over the forgotten path that led to the edge of the freight yard. What remained of the old train depot stood in quiet defiance, its windows boarded, its sign so weather-worn it was just a ghost of lettering. Trains hadn't run through this part of Alabama in decades. And yet someone lived here still. Malcolm stepped out of his car, the crunch of dry weeds underfoot, breaking the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of rust and damp wood, and overhead, clouds gathered like watchers. Beyond the depot sat a lone box car rested, its wheels buried in soil and ivy. The door had been pried open and covered with a blanket for privacy. He approached slowly. A voice stopped him. You from the church. A woman stood by the door, eyes sharp behind years of dust and wariness. She was wrapped in layers blankets, denim, frayed scarves. Her hair was tangled, her boots mismatched. But it was her gaze that made Malcolm pause. It had depth, and it had seen too much. Are you Ruth? He asked. She nodded cautiously. Don't see many callers down this way. I'm not here to preach, Malcolm replied. I'm here about Evelyn. That name dropped between them like a stone into a still pond. For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. Then, with a tired sigh, she turned back toward the boxcar and pulled aside the blanket. Come in, but don't touch anything. Inside, the space was small and meticulously organized, blankets folded, canned food stacked. A chipped lantern casting amber light against the metal walls. A shrine of sorts sat in one corner. Candles, dried flowers, and photographs pinned with rusted nails. She came here more than once, Ruth said, settling onto a crate. Used to sit right where you're sitting. Said she felt safe, like the world didn't have eyes here. Malcolm looked around. What did she tell you? She said something was wrong at the retreat, Ruth replied, her voice lowering. Said there was a place ... under the chapel. They kept things there. Old things, records, maybe, or secrets. She didn't know everything yet, but she knew enough. Ruth reached beneath a blanket and retrieved a worn envelope. She gave me this, said if anything happened to her, someone like you might come. Inside was a photograph, black and white, slightly torn. It showed Evelyn, smiling faintly, standing next to a stone wall with what looked like an iron gate behind her. A number had been carved into the wall, 312. Malcolm turned it over. On the back, in Evelyn's handwriting, "What's hidden can still be seen if you know where to look." "What's this place?" Malcolm asked. "Basement," Ruth said. "Way below, hidden behind the old confessional." She found a key. "I told her to leave it alone." "You think someone hurt her?" Ruth's eyes narrowed. "I think she rattled the cage full of snakes, and they bit back." The wind howled outside, rattling the boxcar's frame. Ruth stood and began lighting one of the candles at her shrine. She came here with questions, but she left with fear. "You should ask yourself what you're willing to carry back." Malcolm tucked the photograph into his folder. The iron gate, the number 312, the retreat's basement. As he rose to leave, Ruth added one last thing. The bell rang the night she vanished. Just once. We heard it from here. Back in his car, the wind pushed dust across the windshield like whispers from the earth itself. The old chapel bell tower rose in the distance, barely visible through the haze, and beneath it, perhaps, waited the truth boxed, barred, and buried. Chapter 9. Hidden below the cross. The chapel at Dust Creek had always worn its secrets well, from the slanted bell tower to the faded mural of St. Agnes on the chancel wall. Everything about the place whispered of lives lived quietly, things buried even quieter. Malcolm returned that evening with Ruth's photograph tucked in his coat pocket, her words looping in his thoughts like a psalm recited too many times. She had spoken of something kept downstairs, and if Evelyn had known it too, that meant whatever truths had been silenced, they lived not only in memory, but in stone. By lantern light, Malcolm descended into the basement beneath the chapel. The stairs groaned beneath his weight. Cold clung to the walls like a second skin. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from weather, but from time. He had brought with him a crowbar and the small brass crucifix he'd taken from the sacristy. Its wooden base split just enough to act as a wedge if he found anything sealed. The basement smelled of mildew and old hymeneals, with spiderwebs stretched like mourning veils across storage racks. Wine barrels rested along one wall, untouched in decades. A few were stamped with the seal of St. Agnes's early years, 1891, and dated notes scrawled in Latin. But Malcolm wasn't here for wine. He paused in front of the western wall, where a wooden crucifix hung at shoulder height. Unlike the rest of the basement, which bore signs of age and damp decay, this crucifix looked ... newer. The wood had not grayed, and the nails hadn't rusted. He reached forward, hesitating only a moment before pulling it gently. It creaked and then clicked. A false panel in the wall gave way with a hollow sigh. Behind it, dust swirled in the dark like breath finally released. Malcolm stepped through the narrow opening, finding a ladder leading downward. The air here was different, heavier, as though prayers had once soaked into the very stone, and then been forgotten. At the bottom was a small square room, bare bulb, stone floor, shelves, lined one wall each filled with manila folders, ledgers, and thin metal boxes marked only with initials. One metal box sat at the center, rusted shut with a military insignia faintly visible beneath the dust, a triangle enclosing an eagle. He tried the lock. It opened with surprising ease. Inside were adoption records, dozens names of children, most listed only by first name, dates, locations, and on a separate sheet, a routing number 1 used by military personnel to classify non-civilian shipments. He thumbed through the rest of the documents, his heart growing heavier with each page. Payments were noted, transfers, consent signatures that looked forged. At the bottom of the box was a photograph. A young woman stood at the edge of the chapel grounds, holding a newborn. The date, 1987. The signature on the back read simply, "For Evelyn." Remember, there were receipts to cash transactions to untraceable organizations, most connected to private military contractors who had since vanished under shell corporations. St. Agnes had been facilitating quiet adoptions through intermediaries, legal, others ... less so. The beneficiaries were people who paid well for silence. Malcolm recognized some of the names: government liaisons, private security firms. Some of them still operated. Others had been shut down in quiet investigations, never made public. He sank onto an old wooden stool in the corner of the chamber, the metal box open in his lap. Everything Evelyn had feared was true, and everything she hadn't yet discovered was worse. This wasn't just about one runaway nun. This was a story threaded through the foundation of the chapel itself, and someone, somewhere, had been protecting it for decades. He looked around the chamber again, noting faint markings in the stone. Tally marks, dozens of them. Perhaps children waiting, or sisters counting down something they couldn't face. And then he saw it, scrawled in black ink on the back wall. "We don't speak, but we remember." Malcolm reached for his notepad and began writing. Names, dates, initials. He wasn't sure yet who to trust, but someone had to know. Someone outside Dust Creek. Someone who could make sure the veil of sanctity didn't hide this rot any longer. And yet, as he climbed out of that hollow place, closing the false wall behind him, a single question echoed. Had Evelyn been silenced because of what she found, or because of what she planned to do next? Chapter 10. The confession collapses. The evening vespers echoed faintly through the chapel, reverent chants drifting like smoke into the halls of St. Agnes. Candles flickered along the nave, casting golden light that softened the cold edges of the worn stone. The sisters moved in unison, their murmured prayers rising and falling like waves, but beneath the rhythm was something tense, barely perceptible, like a taut thread stretched too far. Malcolm sat in the last pew, silent. He had begun to recognize the patterns of the convent, the way the sisters avoided certain doors, how their gazes shifted when he mentioned Evelyn's name. But tonight, that undercurrent broke the surface. As the prayers reached their final refrain, a sudden thud reverberated from the front of the chapel. Sister Lorna collapsed to the stone floor, her body crumpling like parchment. Gasps erupted, prayers halted, and Sister Agnes rushed to her side with the instinctive authority of one who had handled frailty before. Malcolm was beside her in moments. In Lorna's hand was a torn scrap of paper, aged, stained, and half wrapped around her fingers like she had gripped it even in unconsciousness. Malcolm gently took it. Written in hurried ink were the words, "Saw the files. I know what they did. If I disappear, tell Ruth." His heart sank. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a chain, one more link added to the dark truths buried in the convent's silence. The nuns helped Lorna to the infirmary, whispering amongst themselves in fractured fragments. "She hasn't been sleeping," one said. "She's been reading." The word carried weight. Malcolm remained in the chapel, letting the silence settle once more, though it felt heavier now, alive with things unsaid. He studied the torn page. The handwriting matched the journal entries he had found earlier, the ones Evelyn had kept in secret. He recalled Ruth's warning. She was trying to tell people about what they kept downstairs. Sister Madeline joined him quietly. "She's stable," she whispered. "The doctor is on his way." "Has Lorna ever spoken of Evelyn to you?" Malcolm asked. Madeline hesitated. She started asking questions after Evelyn vanished. But she changed, started waking up at odd hours, said she heard things at night, thought she was losing her mind. "She wasn't," Malcolm said. "She found something." He returned to the refectory where he had once been politely welcomed. Tonight the air was different. Sister Agnes sat at the head of the table, her hands folded tightly, jaw clenched. No one spoke. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was expectant. He stood at the doorway and held up the journal page. "Who else knows about this?" No one answered, but Sister Irene's hand twitched. A glance between two younger sisters didn't go unnoticed. "I don't want accusations," Malcolm said, his voice low, "but I want the truth. Evelyn didn't run away. She didn't break her vow. She was silenced because she found something none of you wanted her to find." Agnes stood, calm and calculated. "We are a sanctuary, Father, not a courtroom." Malcolm met her gaze. "Then why are so many people afraid to speak?" That night, the convent buzzed with unease, doors shut with more force than usual. Footsteps passed beneath Malcolm's window until long after midnight. Whispers crept through the stone like vines, winding tighter around a truth no one dared confront fully. At dawn, Sister Lorna stirred in her infirmary cot. Malcolm sat beside her, holding a cup of warm broth. She opened her eyes slowly. "I saw them," she whispered hoarsely. "The ledger's names, payments, Evelyn told me about the girl they sent away. She tried to stop it. Stop what? Lorna shook her head. They made it look clean, made it look holy, but downstairs, That's where they decided. Her hand moved to her chest, grasping the corner of her blanket. Evelyn was going to go to the police. She said she'd rather be excommunicated than complicit. Malcolm's throat tightened. He placed the journal page back in her palm. She trusted you, he said. Lorna nodded weakly. I won't let them bury her truth. That night, Malcolm lit a candle beneath the chapel's altar. He placed the torn journal page beside it. The flame danced, casting long shadows that twisted across the crucifix. And in the flicker of that light, it almost felt as though Evelyn was standing just behind him, waiting, watching, ready to be heard. Chapter 11. The bell rings again. At exactly 2 a.m. The world inside St. Agnes' retreat was as still as the dead. Malcolm awoke with a start, heart pounding before his eyes even opened. It wasn't a dream. The toll had been real low, deliberate, and chilling. The old chapel bell had rung once, only once. He sat up on the narrow cot, still fully clothed from the night before. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and the musty linens of other men who had slept here before him. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and stood, listening. No footsteps, no whispers, only the gentle hush of wind pressing against stone. The chapel bell was never to be rung at night, and certainly not without hands. He crossed the hallway, passing closed doors where nuns likely stirred beneath woolen sheets, pretending not to hear what they heard. The corridor was lined with portraits of past abbesses, each rendered in fading charcoal, all bearing the same hollow stare. The light from his flashlight danced across their faces as he walked, flickering with every creaking step. The entrance to the bell tower groaned open. He had left it locked. He ascended the narrow spiral staircase, its stone steps cool beneath his boots, its handrail wrapped in spiderwebs and decades of dust. His breath misted in the cold air, his heartbeat echoing off the curved walls. With each step, he recalled the accounts Sister Lorna had shared, the voices, the bell, the veil. He had hoped they were echoes of trauma, not prophecy. The top of the tower revealed the small wooden platform beneath the bell's great iron mass. The rope dangled from the beam above, swaying ever so slightly. Moonlight poured in through slits in the stone, casting soft blue shadows across the planks. But it wasn't the movement that made Malcolm stop. Tied near the end of the rope was a strip of white lace. He stepped closer, flashlight aimed low. The lace shimmered slightly, dew caught on its embroidered edges. A tiny cross, stitched in fading blue thread, adorned the corner of Evelyn's veil. He remembered it from her photo in the file. She had worn it the day she took her vows. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The lace was cold and stiff from the night air, but the symbolism burned hot in his chest. This was no accident, no relic misplaced by time. This was a message. He turned slowly, scanning the tower's corners. Dust lay undisturbed, no signs of life. Yet the silence hummed like a held breath. He felt the weight of the bell above him, the tension in the rope below. The air itself seemed to carry memory. He descended with care, veil in hand, holding it as though it might turn to smoke. When he entered the chapel, Sister Madeline stood at the base of the altar, wrapped in a woolen shawl. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on the candlelit crucifix. "You heard it too," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Malcolm replied. She took a hesitant step forward. "We never go up there. Not since Evelyn disappeared." He looked down at the veil. This was tied to the rope. Madeline gasped softly and crossed herself. She wore it every day. Malcolm moved to the altar and laid the lace across the wood. He lit a fresh candle beside it. As the flame caught, a draft passed through the chapel, but the flame held steady. The lace shifted, ever so slightly, as if reacting to some unseen presence. In that moment, Malcolm understood something deeper. This wasn't only about a woman who had vanished. It wasn't only about silence, secrets, and old ledgers hidden beneath chapels. It was about voice. Evelyn was still speaking. The veil was proof, the bell a summons, and the fear on Sister Madeline's face. That was acknowledgement. Someone had helped Evelyn send this, or Evelyn had never truly left. Chapter 12. A confrontation. The morning after the bell tolled, the convent stirred uneasily. The usual rhythm, quiet prayers, slow footsteps, whispered greetings, was now strained. Every movement shadowed by the night's toll. Malcolm rose before dawn, already dressed in his dark coat, Evelyn's veil folded neatly in his pocket. He had seen enough. And now, he needed answers. Mother Ada's quarters were at the end of the eastern corridor, past the infirmary wing where dust settled on unused cots and medical cabinets. She was an older woman, stooped, yet imposing, her presence not softened by age but sharpened. She had once served as a nurse at a military base, a detail in her diocesan file that Malcolm had never overlooked. Her record was clean, even but not all wounds leave ink. He knocked once, then entered. The room was spare, clinical, a simple desk, a crucifix, a locked cabinet, and the scent of old lavender soap clinging to the linen curtains. Mother Ada was seated at her desk, as if waiting, as if she knew. "You were awake when it rang, weren't you?" Malcolm asked. No preamble. She met his gaze without blinking. "I always wake at 2. Habit from the infirmary." Malcolm pulled the lace from his pocket and set it on the desk. It fluttered slightly in the breeze coming through the cracked window. "This belonged to Evelyn," he said. It was tied to the bell rope. Mother Ada's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the desk. A flicker passed through her eyes, not surprise. Recognition. She never knew when to stop, she whispered. Malcolm leaned forward, voice low and sharp. She found records, letters, testimonies. She was scared but determined. She wasn't trying to destroy this place. She was trying to save it from itself. Mother Ada's composure faltered. She was going to ruin everything. "Do you understand that? Do you think they would have let this place survive a scandal like that? The diocese would have buried us and the girls here would have had nowhere to go, no shelter, no quiet." "What about Ruth?" he asked. "What about the others?" "They were risks," she said flatly. "And she chose them over us, over her vows." Silence pressed between them. Outside, morning light filtered through the clouds, brushing pale gold across the floor. Malcolm stood still, his heart heavy not with judgment, but sorrow. "You didn't deny it," he said. "You didn't say she left on her own." Mother Ada looked away. She was given ... guidance. Nothing more. She wouldn't stop asking. She wouldn't let it go. Malcolm opened the folder, in his hand photographs of ledgers, copies of Evelyn's letters, Sister Lorna's journal page. He laid them out one by one on her desk like relics from a buried past. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. "This doesn't go away," he said, "even if no one ever reads her letters. Even if the bell never rings again. It's already here. In the walls. In the silence." Mother Ada's hands trembled slightly. She folded them in her lap. The picture of reverence, though her voice had turned hoarse. "You were a soldier once," she said. "You know the weight of necessity." "I do," Malcolm replied, "but I also know what it means when people hide behind that word, and what it costs." He gathered the papers and turned away. As he reached the door, she spoke again. "She loved this place, you know, even after everything." Malcolm paused. "That's why she tried to save it." He left her there in the growing light, the lace still fluttering on her desk, a ghost's signature, a farewell not yet finished. Chapter 13. Letters never sent. The room still smelled faintly of lavender and old pages, as if time itself had refused to move forward since Evelyn's last breath within these four walls. Malcolm stood silently on the threshold, reluctant to disturb the ghost of presence that clung to the air. The room was spare. Humble, a wooden bed with a woolen blanket pulled taut, a nightstand with a chipped ceramic lamp, and a crucifix above the bed, its paint flaking like neglected truth. A draft curled through the narrow window and lifted the corner of a page that jutted out from under the mattress. Malcolm stepped forward and gently peeled it free. What he found wasn't just one page, but a series of envelopes, crisp and yellowing, each one carefully addressed in Evelyn's deliberate, slanted hand. The return address read only, St. Agnes Retreat House, Dust Creek, Alabama. The recipients were newspapers scattered across the country: the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the Mobile Press Register, all reputable, all respected, all unsent. One by one, Malcolm opened the letters. Inside, the same pattern unfolded: detailed accusations, dates, names, donation ledgers, bank routing numbers, personnel rosters with falsified credentials. She had uncovered more than secrets. She had unearthed a machine built on silence, a system whose very existence depended on the complicit hush of prayers unanswered. One letter began, "To whom it may concern, I write with the knowledge that this may cost me everything, but conscience permits me no less." It listed financial records from 1983 to 2004, transfers from military subsidiaries under code names like Project Olive Tree, St. Bridget Initiative, Silent Meadow. There were mentions of cash donations exchanged for children who were never officially registered. Evelyn had even included scanned copies of forged baptism certificates and school enrollment forms that never made it into diocesan records. Another letter, intended for the editorial desk of a major southern newspaper, read, "Some wounds in the church are not of faith, but of power. I beg you to investigate before more are silenced." But none of the envelopes bore stamps. Not one. Their glue remained dry, unlicked, as if she had sealed her decision but never her letters. In the bottom of the stack was the final draft, one that lacked even an envelope. It had been folded many times, corners softened by hesitation. The ink was smudged in places, possibly by tears, possibly by trembling fingers. Malcolm read it aloud, a whisper in the dim light. "They told me I took a vow of silence, but silence is not submission. Silence is not complicity. Silence, if it shelters evil, becomes its accomplice, and I will not be an accomplice." The page ended abruptly. No signature. Just empty space. Malcolm sat on the edge of the bed and placed the bundle of letters in his lap. The weight of them pressed harder than stone. He imagined Evelyn late at night, hunched over this desk, candle sputtering, her fingers ink-stained and raw, rewriting truths that others had tried to bury. Why hadn't she sent them? Fear. Isolation. The knowledge that once sent, the letters might be intercepted or worse, ignored. The window let in the faintest whistle of wind, and for a moment, Malcolm thought he heard the chapel bell tolling in the distance, though he knew it hadn't rung since that strange, haunted night. He opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a worn copy of the Book of Psalms, Evelyn's name written in delicate cursive on the inside cover. A bookmark held her place at Psalm 94. "They crush your people, Lord. They oppress your inheritance. They slay the widow and the foreigner. They murder the fatherless. They say, the Lord does not see." But she had seen. She had written. And now, someone else had to finish what she couldn't bring herself to send. Malcolm tucked the letters into his satchel. The next steps weren't clear, but one thing was certain: this wasn't just Evelyn's burden anymore. Her truth had lived, even if only in shadows, even if only between pages never mailed. He stood and looked around the room one last time. A life paused in motion, a heart still beating beneath wood and dust and memory. Then he whispered, "You wrote the truth, Evelyn. I'll see that someone reads it." And he walked into the hallway where secrets lingered behind every door, with Evelyn's unmailed letters cradled to his chest like embers waiting to become fire. Chapter 14. The Crossing. The morning fog drifted like gauze over the hills of Dust Creek, softening the outlines of things meant to be seen clearly. Malcolm Price stood at the rusted freight tracks just beyond the town's edge, where the earth held the scent of iron and secrets. His boots rested on cold steel rails, dewed over with silence. In one hand, he held the letters Evelyn had written, pages of unmailed warnings, testimonies, and betrayals. In the other, her veil, still stained faintly with chapel dust, still threaded with the scent of wax and sweat and fear. Behind him, the silhouette of St. Agnes's retreat broke apart like a memory. The old brick walls no longer stood firm in his eyes but shimmered in fragments, bits of whispered prayers, women's laughter, the murmur of guilt pressed beneath decades of ritual. The retreat had once been a sanctuary. Now, it stood as a mausoleum of silenced truths. He could still hear Evelyn's voice in the back of his mind, not in words, but in gesture. The stillness of her room, the desperate scratches behind wallpaper, the trembling hands that had written but never mailed, that had reached for justice but found only shadow. The rail crossing stretched endlessly in both directions, its ties sunken, its signs twisted by time and disregard. Trains hadn't come this way in years. Still, Malcolm stood there as if waiting for one, as if some engine might roar back through the past and bring with it a reckoning. He looked down at the letters, yellowed now, edges frayed, but the ink still held fast. Dates, names, the financial records hidden beneath the chapel floor, the adoption ledgers, Evelyn's words, captured in crisp lines, frozen just before flight. And yet, they hadn't flown. She had hesitated, or perhaps she had been stopped. The veil fluttered slightly in his other hand, lifted by a passing breath of wind. Its lace edge curled like a closing eye. He had choices now. He could send the letters. He could take them to the press, the bishop, even the state. He could light a match under every stone St. Agnes had used to bury its sins. The consequences would be vast. The order would collapse. Lives would be dragged from hiding. The quiet women in those halls would lose what little certainty remained. Their suffering would be named, but would that make it lighter? Or he could walk away, leave the veil and letters as his own burden. Let St. Agnes rot under its own weight. Let those who suffered remain cloaked in silence, if that was what protected them now. Not everyone wanted the truth aired. Some chose shadows, not from fear, but from survival, that he had seen it before. In war zones and hospitals, in outposts where honor was a thinner thread than hope. Sometimes the worst wounds were opened not by violence but by truth. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The wind picked up. He crouched and placed the letters beside the rail, pressing a small stone over them to hold them down. Then, with care that felt like ceremony, he draped Evelyn's veil across them. It looked like an offering, or a gravestone. No train would come. But he had delivered something all the same. He stood and turned back toward town, the veil behind him now shimmering faintly in the growing light. With each step, the chapel's bell tower grew smaller in the distance. The silence remained, but this time, it was chosen. Chapter 15. The box on his desk, back in the harbor-worn edges of Moba, Alabama, where Spanish moss clung to street lamps, and the Gulf wind carried the scent of wet brick. And old stories. Father Malcolm Price returned to his modest upstairs apartment above a shuttered pharmacy. The world outside buzzed faintly with the traffic of another weekday, but inside, time slowed to a hush. He removed his jacket, worn and road-stained from Dust Creek, and placed it over the back of the same wooden chair where he had once prepared sermons no one ever heard. On the table in front of him sat a wooden box, simple, unadorned, built with care. He had carried it with both hands from the Chevy to the cathedral office earlier that day, climbing the grand stone steps of the diocese like someone delivering a relic, not a truth. The bishop had received him behind a desk of dark walnut, framed by stained glass and framed citations. Malcolm offered no speech, only the box. The bishop hadn't opened it. He placed it beside his tea and said simply, "I'll pray on it." And Malcolm had nodded. Inside that box rested Evelyn's veil, folded carefully like a piece of the past that refused to be buried. The letters she never sent, the journal scraps, the photograph Ruth gave back, and tucked in the corner, a paperclip-bound sheaf of findings from the hidden room beneath the chapel, a record of falsified birth documents, donations tracked to former military accounts, and names scribbled in the margins like someone trying to erase them from history. Now, with the night settling over the city, Malcolm lit a candle in the small corner of his desk. The flame flinched as if unsure of its place. He sat quietly, hands resting flat, eyes on the flicker. His thoughts wandered to the cracked soil outside the greenhouse, to Ruth's voice, trembling yet strong, to the cold rope in the bell tower where lace had once danced in the breeze. He remembered Sister Lorna's hands clutching the journal page, the iron tang of old dust in the chapel basement, and the resigned weight in Mother Ada's confession. He remembered Evelyn's room, sunlight slipping through dusty curtains, her prayer book opened to Psalm 31. "In you, Lord, I have taken refuge." Her refuge had not been found in silence, but in defiance. He opened a worn notebook of his own, and, for the first time in weeks, began to write not a sermon, not a report, but a letter, not to the bishop, nor to the press, but to Evelyn. "Dear sister, tonight, I lit a candle, not for closure, but for memory. You didn't vanish. They tried to silence you, bury you beneath psalms and protocol, but you spoke. You screamed with ink, with lace, with every whispered warning in the walls. I don't know if the bishop will open the box. I don't know if the diocese will care, but I do. I did, and I heard you." He paused, listening to the wind rattle, the windows, the distant sound of ships mooring at the bay. "I hope that matters, wherever you are." He signed it simply, MP. Then, he tucked the letter into the back of his Bible, extinguished the candle, and let darkness settle over the room, but not over the truth. Some stories end in fire, others in silence. But this ended in a boxed, a flame, and a name whispered into the night. Evelyn. She had not vanished. She had spoken, and someone had listened.